We don't serve wheelchairs here. The voice rang out through the golden lights of La Lumiere, where Geneva's elite usually gathered. The woman in the wheelchair lowered her head, trembling fingers clutching her purse. The crowd fell silent. A few smirked. A man's voice called out from behind. Then maybe you don't deserve to serve anyone at all. He was Ethan Ward, a single father in a worn dress shirt, holding his young daughter's hand. He stepped forward and pushed the woman's wheelchair through the glass door. No one dared stop him. Moments later, 3 black cars pulled up. "Miss Moreau, the board is waiting." The air froze. The woman they just rejected was the CEO of this entire restaurant chain. Ethan Ward was 37 years old with engineer's hands and eyes that had seen too much loss. 4 years ago, a factory fire had taken his job and his wife, the only person who had ever truly believed in him. Now he lived simply with his 8-year-old daughter, Lila. She was bright and strong, but walked with a limp from a birth defect. Ethan worked as a freelance maintenance engineer. Not wealthy, but proud. Tonight, he wanted to celebrate Lila's birthday. Her only wish was to eat somewhere people don't look at me with pity. He brought her to La Lumiere, Geneva's most famous restaurant chain. Elegant, candlelit, beautiful. As he reached for the door, a cold voice cut through. "We don't serve wheelchairs here." A young woman blocked at the entrance, brown hair slightly disheveled, delicate features pale, sitting in a wheelchair. The staff member said coldly, "We can't have that image appear in the VIP area. Please understand." People stared, some smiled mockingly. Lila gripped her father's hand. "Dad, she's crying." Ethan took a deep breath, his eyes darkening. "Then maybe you don't deserve to serve anyone at all." He stepped forward, gently pushing the woman's wheelchair through the glass door. The crowd parted on both sides. She looked up at him, eyes like crystal. "Thank you. Few people dare stand up for me." The manager was about to speak when 3 black cars stopped outside. Security guards entered. "Miss Moreau, the board is waiting." The entire restaurant froze. She, the woman just humiliated, was Aurora Moreau, CEO of the La Lumiere restaurant chain. A business card fell from her purse. Handwritten, "Even grace needs courage to stand." The video "Single Dad Defends Woman in Wheelchair" spread across the internet in 12 hours. At first, people praised him, the last gentleman of Geneva. But then a second video appeared, edited, only showing Ethan pushing the wheelchair inside with the caption, "How to flirt your way into a billionaire's world." Forums buzzed. A poor single dad appears at the perfect moment. What a coincidence. An entertainment channel called him the man staging PR to rescue CEO Moreau. At the small engineering firm where Ethan worked, colleagues whispered, "He really knows how to get famous. Maybe he wants to be invited back to work at her corporation." Julianne, the branch director and Ethan's old friend, saw his chance to bring him down. He secretly posted a mocking video on the internal network. The clip leaked out, causing the company to receive complaint calls. Next morning, Ethan was called in. "You're a good man, but the media is killing our image. You're suspended." He only nodded. "If doing right cost me my job, I still don't regret it." On the way home, Lila asked, "Dad, why are people angry at you?" He smiled, "Because they don't understand yet that silence is also choosing a side." In the La Lumiere office, Aurora stared at the news screen, lips trembling. "He lost his job because he defended me." Her assistant hesitated. "The press is saying he deliberately approached you." She said, "Let them talk. I'm going to see him." That afternoon, Aurora's car stopped outside a working-class neighborhood. She appeared in her wheelchair, smile faint. "You don't want to see me?" He replied, "You had enough trouble already." She looked around the small apartment, saw the termination letter on the table. "You lost your job because of me, Yang." "No, because they're afraid of the truth." Aurora opened her tablet, showing him the original video. The footage of the staff's humiliation, cold stares, and his voice ringing out clear. "Then maybe you don't deserve to serve anyone at all. I'll release this video, but I want you to help me do something that truly changes things." He was silent. "People will say I'm clinging to you. Let them talk, and we'll do what's right." Lila stepped out holding a scribbled drawing. Good people push others forward. Ethan looked at his daughter, then nodded slowly. I'm in. Aurora released the real video. Social media reversed course. Ethan was called the man who made all of Geneva silent. But she didn't stop there. She appointed him as advisor to the Horizon Initiative, redesigning the entire La Lumiere chain to be accessible for people with disabilities. The board objected. A poor, unemployed engineer, what does he know about hospitality? Aurora answered, he understands what you've forgotten. Respect. Ethan agreed, knowing the road would be difficult. During their work, he discovered Aurora had once been a public accessibility advocate who'd been injured on the stairs of her father's own restaurant. Twist 1. The wheelchair she sat in, symbol of her humiliation, was also the reason she vowed to change the industry. They began to trust each other. But the media dug into Ethan's past, revealing his wife died in a factory explosion owned by Jean Moreau, Aurora's father. Aurora went pale. My company? Yes. That's why I left the industry. She collapsed back, voice choked. If I'd known, I would have apologized long ago. He replied, if you knew and stayed silent, that would be the real crime. Aurora decided to reopen the old files, admit the manufacturing defect, compensate 27 victim families, including Ethan's. Shareholders erupted, demanding her resignation. On the day of the decision meeting, Aurora appeared with Ethan. Ethan presented the design for Lumiere Free, the world's first completely barrier-free restaurant. He said, she's not just a CEO. She's someone brave enough to apologize for an entire generation. Freeze moment 2. The board went silent. Aurora removed her gloves, revealing a long scar on her wrist. She spoke softly. I once lost the ability to walk, but I never lost my reason to move forward. Applause rang out. The board agreed to keep her. Light reflected off the silver wheelchair, symbol of rebirth. But the real work was just beginning. Over the next 3 months, Ethan and Aurora worked endless hours. They visited every La Lumiere property across Switzerland and France. Ethan designed automated doors with eye-tracking sensors, tables that adjusted electronically, braille menus, service counters wheelchair users could navigate independently. Aurora trained every staff member personally, not just on procedures, but on dignity, on seeing people first, equipment second. When someone enters in a wheelchair, she told them, you don't see limitation. You see a customer. That's all. A customer who deserves the same beautiful experience as anyone else. The transformation wasn't easy. Some staff quit. Some investors threatened to pull funding. But Aurora stood firm. My father built this company on exclusion. I'm rebuilding it on inclusion. Anyone who can't accept that can leave. During one late-night working session, Aurora found Ethan staring at old factory blueprints. What are you looking at? She asked. The original safety designs. The ones my wife helped me create, the ones your father's company ignored. Aurora wheeled closer. Tell me about her. Ethan was quiet for a long moment. Marie, she was a chemical engineer. Brilliant. She saw the flaws in the ventilation system before anyone else. We reported it together. They fired us both. And then she went back, tried one more time to warn them, said she couldn't live with herself if something happened, and she'd stayed silent. His voice broke. The explosion happened during her shift. Aurora reached out, taking his hand. I'm so sorry. She died doing what she believed was right. Sometimes I wonder if I honor her memory by staying silent, or by speaking up even when it costs everything. You honor her, Aurora said firmly, by teaching your daughter that courage isn't optional, that silence in the face of injustice is its own form of cruelty. Ethan looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the CEO or the heiress, but someone who understood what it meant to lose everything and choose to rebuild anyway. Why are you doing this? He asked. The Horizon Initiative, reopening your father's cases, risking your entire company. We saw now. Aurora smiled sadly. Because 3 years ago, I tried to enter my own restaurant, the one my father built, and they turned me away. Said I was bad for the brand image. That night, I sat outside for 2 hours, unable to move, unable to process that the company bearing my family name saw me as shameful. What did you do? I went home and started planning. I knew I'd inherit the company when my father died, and I knew I'd burn it all down and rebuild it right, or I'd burn out trying. That's why you didn't fire anyone that night at the door. I wanted them to see, to watch as the woman they rejected became their boss, to understand that cruelty has consequences, even when you think you're safe. They sat in silence, two broken people building something whole. The quarterly board meeting arrived, the showdown everyone anticipated. Gerald, the CFO, led the charge. Miss Moreau, in 3 months you've spent 12 million euros on accessibility improvements with zero return. You've publicly admitted liability in a decades-old case, tanking our stock. And you've hired a man with personal grievances as senior advisor. This is corporate suicide. Several board members nodded. Aurora sat calmly at the head of the table. Ethan beside her. Finished? She asked. We moved to remove you from operational control, Gerald continued. You're too emotionally compromised to lead. Interesting theory. Aurora opened a folder. Let me present an alternative. Ethan? Ethan stood laying out architectural renderings across the table. Lumiere free, a complete accessibility integrated from foundation to fixtures. Not add-ons, not accommodations. Design principle. He walked them through the specs. Average cost per location, 40,000 euros. Minimum. 20 locations in Switzerland alone. That's 0.8 million. Gerald smiled. Thank you for proving our point. But, Ethan continued, there are 15 million people in the EU with mobility limitations. Another 20 million elderly with accessibility needs. 35 million potential customers who currently avoid most restaurants because access is uncertain. He pulled up market research. The pilot location in Geneva saw customer volume increase 42% in month 1. Month 2, 51%. Why? Because word spreads fast when people finally find a place that genuinely welcomes them. Board members were reading now, leaning forward. Beyond revenue, Ethan said, EU accessibility laws are changing. By 2026, all public accommodations must meet new standards. Companies that adapt early become industry leaders. Those that resist become examples of what not to do. He sat down. So yes, Miss Moreau is spending money now to position La Lumiere as the gold standard before accessibility becomes mandatory. That's not emotional compromise, that's strategy. Silence filled the room. Vittorio, the oldest board member, spoke. I knew Jean Moreau, built this company from nothing, but he built it with old thinking. The world has changed. Either we change with it or we become irrelevant. He looked around the table. I move to approve continued funding and officially appoint Ethan Ward as Chief Accessibility Officer with full authority over implementation. Seconded, another board member said quickly. Gerald's face flushed red. This is a mistake. Aurora met his eyes. Then leave. But understand, if you walk out that door, you're choosing the past over the future, and I won't have people stuck in the past running my company. Gerald stood, grabbed his briefcase, and left. 2 other board members followed. Aurora watched them go, then turned to the remaining board. Anyone else? No one moved. Good, let's build something worth being proud of. 1 year after that night at the restaurant, Lumiere Free opened in the heart of Geneva. The flagship location was glass and light, designed by Ethan with Aurora's vision guiding every choice. Automatic doors that responded to presence, not just motion. Tables adjustable from wheelchair height to standing height. Digital menus available in 6 languages. Braille, large print, and audio. Service counters at multiple heights. But more than the physical space, the culture had changed. Staff didn't just accommodate disabilities, they expected diversity, welcomed it, celebrated it. Opening night drew international press. BBC, CNN, Swiss television, disability rights organizations from across Europe. Aurora gave the speech, Ethan standing beside her. 2 years ago, I was denied entry to one of my family's restaurants. One man didn't walk past. He stepped in. He risked everything because he believed I deserved better. She paused, emotion thick in her voice. Ethan Ward showed me that my father's company was built on exclusion. But he also showed me it could be rebuilt on dignity, not through policies or PR, but through actual, tangible change. She gestured around the space. This exists because one father taught his daughter that silence isn't neutral, that standing by is taking a side, that courage is a choice we make every single day. The crowd applauded. Lila, now 9, cut the ribbon with oversized scissors, grinning widely. I declare this restaurant open for everyone. Cheers erupted. The first customers entered. A family with 2 wheelchair users, an elderly couple with walkers, a mother with a stroller, and 3 small children. They didn't hesitate at the door, didn't scan for barriers or obstacles. They simply entered, welcomed. One elderly man stopped, tears in his eyes. I haven't felt this welcome in a public space in 30 years. Aurora wheeled over to him. Then we're doing something right. That evening, after the crowds cleared, Ethan found Aurora in the empty restaurant, staring out at Lake Geneva. You should be celebrating, Bassam, he said. I am, quietly. He sat beside her. What are you thinking about? That maitre d', the one who started all this by being cruel. I wonder if he knows, if he understands that his one moment of cruelty sparked something that changed thousands of lives. Does it matter? Maybe not, but I hope he sees this, sees what happens when someone chooses differently. Lila ran over holding a drawing she'd been making. Look, I drew the restaurant. It showed stick figures of all sizes, some in wheelchairs, some with canes, all holding hands in front of a building labeled Open for All. Aurora's eyes filled. It's perfect, Lila. Miss Aurora, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you and my dad going to get married? Ethan choked on his coffee. Aurora laughed, a real laugh that transformed her face. Your dad and I are partners, Aurora said carefully. We're building something important together. That's what married people do, Lila said matter-of-factly. After Lila ran off, Aurora and Ethan sat in comfortable silence. She's not entirely wrong, Aurora said quietly. About partnership, about building something together, she trailed off. Ethan took her hand. About finding someone who sees you, not your chair, not your money, not your pentes, just you. Aurora squeezed back. And about finding someone who challenges you, who makes you braver than you knew you could be. They sat watching the city lights reflect off the lake, 2 people who'd found each other in the wreckage of injustice and built something beautiful. 2 years after the video went viral, Geneva had changed. Inspired by Lumiere Free, other businesses adopted accessibility standards. Museums redesigned entrances, hotels renovated rooms. The city council passed new building codes. Ethan opened Human Reach, a design firm specializing in accessible architecture. Aurora was the primary investor, though she remained CEO of La Lumiere. Their latest project, redesigning Geneva's central train station, making it the most accessible transit hub in Europe. At the dedication ceremony, the mayor spoke. Too often, we design our world for an imaginary average person. Ethan Ward and Aurora Moreau showed us that the average person doesn't exist. There's only people, each with different needs, all deserving equal access to public space. After the speeches, Ethan and Aurora walked, or rather, he walked and she wheeled, along the lake. Lila ran ahead, chasing swans, laughing with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. Do you ever regret it? Aurora asked. That night, everything that followed. Ethan considered. I lost a job, gained death threats, spent months being called a fraud and a manipulator. So yes. No, because I also gained in this, a chance to honor Marie's memory by fighting for what she believed in, a chance to show Lila that doing right matters more than doing easy. And, he paused, and I met you, someone who understands that broken isn't the same as finished, that the worst moments can become catalysts for the best changes. Aurora stopped her wheelchair, looking up at him. Can I tell you something I've never told anyone? Always. That night, when the maitre d' turned me away, part of me believed him. Part of me thought maybe I really was bad for the image, that maybe my father was right to hide me away, that maybe I was less than. Her voice shook. And then you stepped in. No hesitation, no calculation, just immediate, instinctive defense of my dignity. You gave me back something I'd lost. My belief that I deserved to exist in public space. That my presence wasn't a problem to be managed, but a right to be respected. Ethan knelt beside her wheelchair. You were never less than. The world just needed to catch up to you. She reached out, touching his face. Thank you for seeing me, for standing up, for showing me that one person really can make a difference. We made the difference together. Yes, together. They sat by the lake as the sun set, painting the sky gold and purple. Lila came running back, dropping into the grass beside them. Dad, Miss Aurora, can we do this every Sunday? Just the three of us? Ethan and Aurora looked at each other, something unspoken but understood passing between them. Yes, they said together. Lila grinned. Good, because you're my family. 3 years after that viral video, Human Reach had designed accessible spaces in 12 countries. Lumiere had expanded to 30 locations, each one built on principles of universal design. And Ethan Ward, the single dad who'd simply refused to stand by, was named European Accessibility Advocate of the Year. At the awards ceremony in Brussels, he brought Lila and Aurora. When asked to give a speech, he kept it short. 3 years ago, I saw someone being treated unfairly. I didn't think about consequences or strategy or public image. I just thought, this is wrong, and someone needs to say so. He looked at Aurora. That moment changed my life. But more importantly, it changed thousands of other lives. Because one woman had the courage to admit her company was broken and the determination to fix it. Because one woman chose accountability over image. He turned back to the audience. Accessibility isn't charity. It's not even kindness. It's justice. It's building a world where everyone can participate, contribute, belong. Where dignity isn't a privilege granted to some, but a right guaranteed to all. He held up the award. This belongs to everyone who's ever been told they don't belong, who've been excluded, dismissed, diminished. You belong. Your presence matters. And we'll keep fighting until the world reflects that truth. The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes. That night, back in Geneva, the three of them returned to the original Lumiere free location. The restaurant was closed for a private event. Their event. Ethan had cooked. Aurora had set the table. Lila had made decorations. What are we celebrating? Lila asked. Family, Aurora said simply. We're celebrating family. They ate and laughed and told stories as the city lights sparkled beyond the windows. After Lila fell asleep on the couch, Ethan and Aurora sat by the window watching the lake. I never thought I'd be here, Aurora said. 3 years ago, I was angry, hurt, ready to burn everything down out of spite. And now? Now I'm building with someone who makes me better, building something that actually matters. Ethan took her hand. Marie would have liked you. She always said the world doesn't need perfect people. It needs persistent ones. I'm definitely persistent. Yes, you are. They sat in silence, comfortable and complete. Outside, a small wooden sign reflected the streetlight. Hidden heart stories. Stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Stories about ordinary people who choose extraordinary courage. Stories that prove respect isn't kindness. It's justice. 5 years after that night at La Lumiere, the impact had rippled far beyond Geneva. The Horizon Initiative had become a global movement. 57 restaurants across Europe, licensing agreements with hotel chains in Asia, a training program that had certified over 2,000 hospitality workers in accessibility practices. But the real measure of success wasn't in the numbers. It was in the letters Aurora received every week, from parents of disabled children who could finally take their families out to dinner without anxiety, from elderly people who'd stopped going to restaurants years ago and were now rediscovering the joy of dining out, from wheelchair users who sent photos of themselves smiling in front of Lumiere-free locations with the caption, "Finally welcomed." One letter stood out, from a young woman named Sophie in Lyon. Dear Miss Moreau, I was born with cerebral palsy. For 23 years, I believed public spaces weren't for me. Then I saw the video of you being denied entry and the man who stood up for you. I cried for an hour, not from sadness, but from recognition. Someone finally understood. 2 years later, I entered your restaurant in Lyon. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. Last week, I got engaged. We're having our wedding reception at Lumiere free. Because the place that first made me feel worthy should be where I celebrate the happiest day of my life. Thank you for existing. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for teaching me I was never the problem. Aurora read the letter to Ethan over coffee one Sunday morning. This is why, she said softly. This is why we do it. Ethan nodded, but his eyes were on Lila, now 13, who was sketching designs for accessible playground equipment at the table. His daughter had grown up watching her father and Aurora rebuild systems of exclusion into structures of welcome. She'd absorbed the lesson without anyone teaching it explicitly. Kindness wasn't enough. Justice required action. Dad, Lila said, not looking up from her drawing, when I grow up, I want to design cities where everyone can go anywhere, where nobody ever feels like they don't belong. Ethan's throat tightened. You'll do it, Bug. I have no doubt. Aurora wheeled over, looking at Lila's sketches. These are brilliant. Have you thought about studying architecture? Maybe, or engineering like Dad, or business like you. Lila finally looked up, grinning. Or maybe all three. Is that allowed? For you, Aurora said, anything's allowed. Later, as they walked along the lake, Lila running ahead as always, Aurora said something she'd been holding back. I used to think my accident was the worst thing that ever happened to me, that I'd lost everything that mattered. My mobility, my independence, my future. Ethan stayed quiet, letting her continue. But if it hadn't happened, I'd still be the person my father raised. Shallow, privileged, blind to anyone who didn't look like me. I'd have inherited his company and continued his legacy of exclusion without ever questioning it. She stopped her wheelchair. Sa wheelchair, looking out at the water. That accident broke me, but it also woke me up. And meeting you, watching you stand up when everyone else stood by, that showed me broken things can become beautiful things, that the worst moments can be transformed into the best purposes. Ethan knelt beside her chair. You transformed yourself. I just witnessed it. No, you believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself. You saw worth when I felt worthless. You treated my dignity as non-negotiable when everyone else saw it as optional. She took his hand. Thank you for that night, for every night since, for building this life with me. Thank you, Ethan replied, for showing Lila what courage looks like, for proving that power isn't about control, it's about service, for loving us. They sat by the water as the sun set, three people who'd found each other through injustice and built something extraordinary through justice. The world hadn't changed completely. There were still barriers, still prejudice, still people who saw wheelchairs before they saw humans. But there were also more Ethans. More people who refused to stand by. More people who understood that silence was complicity. And there was Aurora, no longer hiding behind wealth or shame, but leading with vulnerability and strength. The fight wasn't over. It never would be. But they were in it together. And that made all the difference. Respect isn't kindness. It's justice. And justice begins when one person decides silence is no longer acceptable. When one person stands up. When one person pushes a wheelchair through a door that should never have been closed. The world changes not through grand gestures, but through small acts of courage repeated endlessly by ordinary people who refuse to accept cruelty as normal. Be that person. Stand up.